Greetings, adventurers! You're listening to the Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood with me, Professor Atwood. I'm glad you're here, and I can't wait to tell you about my latest journey. So please, settle in, relax, and prepare to quietly drift off with me to parts known, unknown, and even some places in between. Comfortable? Very well. Let's get underway. Good evening, fellow adventurers. Thanks again for joining me. This is another episode of the Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood, and I am, of course, your host, Jonathan Peter Atwood. And I gotta say, I'm just pleased as punch that you decided to join me on another wonderful journey. And as you know, last time I was on the Orient Express going to the Science Conference. Well, this is it. I actually got to the Science Conference and wanted to tell you, they say conference or convention. I mean, it's a science rose by any other name. It kind of does the same thing. So I want to tell you a little bit about my experiences there and how it went. You see, science conventions or conferences, they're very interesting. And it's a great chance for all of us scientists to kind of reconnect. A lot of scientists, we're a solitary bunch, and that's the truth. We don't always get together a lot, and we don't always, when we do, we're kind of talking about science. I mean, obviously we're going to do that at the Science Conference in Munich, but one of the things that I love about this conference is there's a social aspect to it. This is where scientists can really kind of let their hair down, so to speak, and become a little more social and just, have a little fun. I don't want to say things like scientists are all a bunch of stuffed shirts, but I will say that sometimes we're a bit reserved. We're so obsessed with science all the time, day and night. We live and breathe science, trying to make the world a better place over and over again. We don't really have time sometimes to just hang out, relax, go to a movie, or go to a bar or restaurant, or just talk about things that we really enjoy. Hobbies, books we've read that aren't textbooks, or something that one of our colleagues has actually written, or something in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's something different. Sometimes we talk about Game of Thrones. I mean, there's other things that we do other than talk about science. We were just talking about documentaries the other day, and with a couple people on a Zoom call, and it's okay. Well, they were science documentaries, but you know what I'm talking about. There's other things that we do. We do have hobbies, and we do have other interests. I'm a big fantasy fan, and I do like Game of Thrones, like I said, but I kind of go way back to the Lord of the Rings books. I really enjoy them. It's one of those places where I can just turn the science off. Fantasy and science, they're two different words with two very different meanings. So sometimes you just need a vacation from all the facts and figures, scientific laws, and scientific rules. But they're not always etched in stone, by the way, and the theorems and the postulates and, of course, everything else. Now, Merlin, as you know, is a magician. He was helping King Arthur. So there are certain things that I can enjoy because I can turn off that science part of my brain, especially with magic, too, and with fantasy, and, well, sometimes it's called sword and sorcery. I enjoy the Conan stories as well, and even the films, I have to say, they're kind of a guilty pleasure. I'm a bit of a movie guy when I'm not in the lab. So with all these new services, I mean, you could just see lots and lots of movies, and I could see my favorites over and over, including the guilty pleasures. I like the Conan movies. I like James Earl Jones in them, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, obviously, but, there was one with Wilt Chamberlain, who was a famous basketball player, and that film I also thoroughly enjoyed. Now, I don't want to get into a big debate about science versus magic because, a lot of people, including some of my colleagues, will say magic is just science that we don't understand yet. And I think that's 90% of the time true, but I really feel that there is true magic, and I think when we go on some of these other journeys that I've planned, I think you'll see that. And we'll talk about it because, like I said, I believe that's true where, magic is just science we haven't understood or even discovered yet. But I do think there's a small portion of what I'd like to call true elemental magic. And I say that because there are primal forces that are different energy sources than traditional science. And then they power different things. And those things are what we refer to as magic. So I really think, well, actually, in a way, it kind of is like science. I mean, I'm talking about power sources too, but I really think that there is that separation. There's science that hasn't quite explained what we've called magic, and then there's the certain part that is actually true elemental magic that doesn't follow the same rules that science does. But it does follow its own rules. That's what's really interesting. Now, I'm sure you could have a magic conference, and there'd be a lot of panels about magic wands and divination and runes and summoning and what have you. I don't know if insurance would cover something like that. I mean, I think it would be a really difficult program to underwrite just because of, the possibility of things going wrong. Now, of course, at the science conference, we practice a lot of science there. I mean, obviously, we've got our panels and everything else, but we also take it as an opportunity to share data with colleagues and present scientific experiments. Sometimes there are breakthroughs and discoveries right at the conference. Now, think about doing that with magic. I could only imagine what that would look like. You could create a new elixir. This could cure the common cold. Or you could create a magic implosion to destroy the universe. I mean, you just don't know. It could be very dicey. I mean, science is the same way, of course. There's always those benefits and risks. But I think science is a lot more accepted and a lot more understood than magic, so I think the science conference just seems to make more sense in that realm. Anyway, the thing about the science conference is that it's always in Munich, and Munich is a beautiful city. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's great. I do like to do a little sightseeing while I'm there. The conference is only a few days long, but I usually like to tag a day or two on just to see the sights. Honestly, every once in a while, the science convention just isn't as good as it was in previous years, and it just depends on the programming, just like any other conference. So, some years I might skip a day of the conference and then just go and see some interesting things. I do like art galleries, but not too many art galleries. Some people can just go from one to the other, but that's not me. I like just going to one or two art galleries, and then I'm kind of done. So there's this one that I like, though, but it's very difficult to pronounce. I'm going to try it, though. It's the Alte Pinakothek, and it's one of the world's oldest art galleries. And it was ordered by King Ludwig I to house the Wittelsbach dynasty's art collection, starting in the 1500s or something like that. You could see your Da Vinci's and Peter Paul Rubens, and there's a couple of really nice ones in there. You might even see a Rembrandt when you're there. But what I really love about it is the architecture of the building itself. It's a little deceptive at first glance. It looks very symmetrical and very basic. But on the second glance, when you start looking at it, you notice all these great shapes for the windows and doors, and the symmetry of the actual building is really interesting. In fact, your eye just kind of wants to stay there and gaze on it for a while before you even go in the door. Again, highly recommended for sure. One of the other places I like to go is the Englischer Garden. It's absolutely massive, and it was created in the 18th century. And it just seems to go on and on. It's something like 360 hectares. It's lawns and pastures, it's waterways, there's even a lake, and it's one of the world's largest urban parks. It's actually bigger than New York Central Park. If you've ever been to Central Park, obviously, it's a very huge park in the middle of a giant city. Now, it's got some really interesting features, and I don't know if you guys know this, but when you go to these large parks, they have a lot of things you wouldn't expect to be there. Like this one had a Japanese tea house. It was added in 1972. But there's one thing that I was absolutely blown away by the first time I went to the park. They have surfing. Now, I'm not even kidding. The man-made Eisbach River has a current, and people actually surf on it, and they can ride on the board for almost like a full minute, which I guess in surf terms is ridiculously long. You know, I have some scientist colleagues that do surf, and I always find it interesting because they have certain rules that they follow. And one of them is that they'll never surf in the rain, which always baffled me from a scientific perspective. I mean, if you close your eyes, would you even really know the difference? I think that what you have to understand is that surfers take their surfing very seriously, even if no one else does. But those scientists, I'll tell you, they work hard and they play hard. When I see them on the surf, or hanging 10, I guess you call it, I know that they've made a breakthrough in the lab, because this is kind of the way they celebrate, so it makes sense. I mean, you gotta let off that steam, however you want to do it. There's plenty of different ways to do it. Tesla went golfing. Einstein, he was actually a big white water rafter. Not a lot of people know that. Every time he would come up with a big breakthrough, like E = mc squared, you know where he was? He was in a raft after that, paddling and avoiding rocks, and just having the time of his life. So anyway, with my sightseeing done, one of the things I also like to do is go to the local restaurants. But now I do something a little different. I went to a restaurant called the Little London Bar and Grill in Munich because I like to see what people do to create and run a restaurant from another city in another city that isn't that city. So it always fascinates me, like with all the variables, how will this actually be pulled off? Sure, you could go and sample the finest local cuisine. You could do that, of course you can. But it takes something truly creative to defy the odds and say, look, I'm going to take the city, and then I'm going to make food from the city, then I'm going to bring it to this other city, and then I'm going to call it the first city, and then I'm going to serve food from the city in the city that isn't that city where the food is from. I think it's really exciting. And it was great. I really enjoyed it. So you definitely want to check it out, and the steak too if you're a meat eater, and that's really something to look forward to. But by then, it was time to go to the convention. I saw the sights, had a good meal, and then I was ready to go. But there was one place I wanted to mention before I talk about the conference, and that's the Deutsches Museum, the world's largest museum of science and technology. The conference used to be held there because it's a science museum with hands-on exhibits under multiple scientific disciplines like physics, nanotechnology, biotechnology, and even sound waves. You can do experiments with musical instruments with acoustics. Actually, they call it acoustic fantasies, and I'm not really sure why. But it's interesting, the science conference decided to move from the Deutsches Museum to an undisclosed location. I'm not exactly sure why, but it had something to do with the science organization marketing. Something like they felt the science conference in a science museum was too on the nose. So I don't really understand marketing. But I guess they had a reason, and that made sense to them. But it's a wonderful museum. So you really want to check it out when you're there, and it's good for kids too. I always encourage kids to go to science museums and do some hands-on exhibits. That's their first exposure to doing experiments, and it's where kids can actually start to see and enjoy and be exposed to a world of science, and they might be really engaged. I mean, our future scientists, that's where they're going to come from. They're not just going to appear. They have to be engaged at an early age and to be interested in saving the world. So that's the kind of thing through science that we really want to encourage. So I get asked a lot, like, what was the science conference actually like? And I will say this. It's broken up into a couple of different sections and activities. There's a convention floor where we walk around and see experiments in progress. There are vendors. If anyone needs new beakers or swabs or cleaning supplies for the lab, it's all there. There's also 85% of the elements on the periodic table that you can actually purchase right there on the vendor floor. There's a couple of weird ones like cadmium that you would think would be easy to get. It's not. So sometimes scientists have to get there early, then take a number to get the certain elements that they want, because you can only get them at the science conference. So it creates a long line, and I honestly, I don't really approve. It's almost like a false supply and demand. You know, elements should be available for everyone. If you want an element, you should be able to get an element. I mean, they're here in nature. We just discovered them. We really shouldn't be marketing them. If there's one thing about the science conference I'm not in love with, it's the structure of the vendors. But what are you going to do? It's part of the conference, and it's a big money maker for them. And I understand why they do it. You're not going to always agree with everything. I think that's the takeaway here. But there's definitely some great things about the floor, and one of them is you always run into an old friend or colleague. You get to hear what they've been up to and what they're working on, and because, like I said, you just don't see them that often. One of the interesting things is, of course, the different sections on the floor, like Science Alley, where people set up experiments right on the floor. Now, I've thought about doing that. It's a little expensive, but that's not the reason I don't do it. I like being mobile. I like walking around. The problem is, it's when you've got a table or an experiment note. That's what they call the bigger ones. You just kind of get tethered to it for the whole conference. Like I said, I mean, I like to move around. So the next part of the conference was the panels. You know, there's a lot of great panels. You can't go to all of them, but I definitely went to a couple of good ones. I mean, people ask me, do you do panels? And every once in a while, I do. I don't like to do them. I feel like there's just a lot of opinions. I know, even in science where you would think, well, there can't be that many opinions. There are. There are a ton of different opinions in science. No matter how many facts and figures you present, there's always going to be differing opinions. And that can all be very healthy, but it can also be very confusing, because when you have different conclusions being generated after the exact same data is presented, that can be good and spur debate, but it can also be detrimental, because that means no one can agree, and as a result, nothing ever gets done or moved forward. But thankfully, there is more consensus than discord in science, so it's not a huge problem. Now, there was a panel called Science and Science Fiction, What's the Difference? And I did attend that, and it was very enlightening. We always talk about science and science fiction, what's the difference, and the go-to is always, science fiction is just a few years ahead of science. I think, again, we talked about magic earlier, and I think that's mostly true, but there are certain science fiction things that are definitely going to happen, or have already happened, like time travel. Time travel is one that people argue about a lot, and they say, well, if time travel exists, why haven't we seen anyone from the future? And here's the thing. They may be really good at it, and they're covering their tracks, and they're not affecting the timeline, and they're staying away from the butterfly effect. Science, science fiction, and especially writing often kind of combine. Ray Bradbury understood this and maybe even warned us when he wrote The Sound of Thunder. It's a brilliant short story that takes a look at what happens when time travel is not taken seriously. One of the arguments that I just don't agree with is the one about, well, if there have been time travelers, why haven't we seen them yet? Okay, first of all, let's look at it. If they're really good at it, like I said before, you wouldn't have seen them. And second of all, if there were time travelers traveling back in time, would they really pick right now and then show up for you to see them specifically? I think time travel is definitely one discipline that's misunderstood. And, okay, I'm going to let the cat out of the bag here. Yes, I have a time machine. I built it last summer. I haven't fully tested it yet. But when I do, we're definitely going to be going on a time journey as well. We'll see how well it works. Maybe we'll do multiple ones. I don't want to get ahead of myself here, and I don't know how far forward or back in time I'm going to be able to go yet. Initial testing is just been 45 minutes, so, I'm hoping, obviously, to increase that number considerably. So anyway, I was talking about science and science fiction. What's the difference? And, I think the gist of the panel was that there was no difference, which I thought was interesting, but clearly there is. While there is a passion for science, I think there's a much larger passion for science fiction, because science deals with what's possible and what could be possible, whereas science fiction deals with what would happen if we put all of these known rules aside. Then what could we do? We could open up the science box and really go outside of it. I think it's important, and I heard one of the panelists say, actually, I'm not sure. Honestly, I fell asleep for the last 20 minutes. I'm not really sure how it concluded. I was tired from the train ride and also from watching surfers on the lake in the park. So I was a little exhausted, and I had this giant steak at the Little London Bar and Grill. It was good, but as you know, steak, it makes you sleepy. The portions were just so big. But from what I did hear, I really did like the panel. I thought it was great, and I think it's a worthwhile discussion to have. Science and science fiction, what's the difference? Even though I fell asleep at the end, I still thought it was really good. There's good panels and bad panels at the conference, and sometimes you can't really tell which is which until you go to them. Like, for instance, the next one I went to was called Superconductors, or Just Okay. Sometimes scientists like to put little jokes in the titles. Now, this one I did fall asleep in from start to finish. So I don't really know what they talked about, and I will blame my falling asleep this time on it being boring. I mean, sometimes that does happen. Science can be very dry, especially when you're talking about superconductors, I guess. I mean, like I said, I don't know. I was asleep in the first few minutes. But anyway, after that I was pretty well rested. So I went to the next panel, which was the Science of Science, which I found really engaging because it really broke down what we all do and how really important it is. But it also broke down how we do what we do and why. There's a lot of great discussions and a lot of great feedback. There was a Q&A session at the end too. One scientist was asking, well, how do we know we're really all scientists and not just like faux scientists? The truth is, I think he was just a little insecure because you can't even get invited to the science conference until you've already passed the rigorous confirmation requirements. The thing about science is that you could be certified, and you could go through all these tests and boards to be called a scientist. But none of that really matters. It really doesn't. My personal opinion is that we're all scientists at heart. We all have that curiosity and like to see how things work and why they work, and how we can make them work better. As far as I'm concerned, just because you don't ride a secret train to attend a secret private conference that's not open to the public at an undisclosed location doesn't make you a non-scientist. It just means there's a difference between you being a scientist or an accredited or certified one. I mean, you could use all those words, but I personally don't care. I want to see everyone have that curiosity and that need to understand and that need for changing things that need changing to make things just better. So if you're listening right now, I consider you a scientist. That's how I look at it, and maybe one day you'll be invited to this conference as well. And I hope to see you here. I really do mean that. So the last panel I actually went to was Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, or is it more of a guideline? That was probably the longest panel title I've ever come across, but it did make some interesting points. Now, the thing that always strikes me about Heisenberg is, he's got this weird, well, I don't know how else to put it. It has nothing to do with his principle, but it's his hair. I mean, I know people think scientists don't pay a lot of attention to their hair, but that's kind of a misconception. I think it's the opposite. I think scientists spend a lot of time on their hair, and they deliberately try to make it so you'll remember their scientific achievements by how weird and odd that they make their hair look. Now, I'm looking at another picture of Heisenberg right now and telling the story, and all I can think of is, man, that was a great, huge head of hair that he was very proud of. It almost looks like a lion's mane, like a science mane, a lion science mane. Anyway, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Basically, the way I can explain it to you is that it's hard to get accurate readings because just the actual nature of measuring something can change things on a quantum level. So when you're dealing with quantum particle photons, it's very difficult to see because just the observing of the particles can change things. I guess think of it like if you have a baseball and a cupcake. You're blindfolded. You throw the baseball at the cupcake, and you know that if you hit the cupcake's gonna go everywhere. You don't know exactly where all the pieces of the cupcake are going to go. You don't know if you're still going to be hungry after the baseball hits the cupcake. And you don't know if the knot is too tight and you can't get the blindfold off at the end, or you might struggle and need some help. So that's kind of the way Heisenberg's uncertainty principle works. But the main thing to remember is the baseball and the cupcake and being blindfolded. I think that's really important. So you'll never really know how you affect something because as you measure it, you know you might be changing it at the time. Now, the principle itself has the word uncertainty in it. It's really kind of gets you off the hook. Because when you have a principle like that, and you're like, well, nobody really knows, and we don't really know how it could affect things, and when you stake your claim on an uncertainty, no one can really prove you wrong. So it's kind of like a scientific safe haven to traffic in vagaries. But that being said, I think he's got a point to the uncertainty principle and its value in the scientific community for measuring. There's no disputing that it has to be addressed one way or the other. One of the things I find absolutely fascinating about the science conference is that there's something where people actually dress up as their favorite scientists from the past and then pretend to be those scientists throughout their time at the convention, and they'll never break character. They'll walk on the convention center floor and pretend to be these people, and it's entertaining, I have to say, and I think everyone enjoys it. It wasn't really something that was originally planned, it just kind of happened, and now it's become a tradition. And there are certain scientists who attendees tend to emulate more than others, like Madame Curie is obviously a big one. She's been very influential in the scientific community. She was the first woman to actually win a Nobel Prize, and the first person and only woman to win the Nobel Prize twice in 2 different scientific fields. Now, she also conducted pioneering research in radioactivity. In fact, the term radioactivity she actually coined. But she also coined the term staycation, but she doesn't really get credit for that, which is a shame. I think her family probably could have made some money on that. She also discovered 2 elements, polonium and radium. Now, it's one of those things like chances are if you discover 2 elements, they're probably hiding right next to each other. It's like if you tip over a flower pot in your garden. You know there's probably not going to be just one earwig. It's going to be at least 2. So I think she gets credit for both, but most likely they were probably right next to each other, which is still fine, and she should still get credit for it, absolutely. Now, one of the things that I really admire about her was how much good she actually did. Not only did she move science forward, but she had a great heart. I mean, she was helping provide X-ray services to field hospitals during World War I. And she developed these mobile radiography units. It's just incredible what she did. Now, the science players, well, a few of them, did carry around polonium and radium, which wasn't the greatest idea with a conference full of people. Supposedly, they had adequate shielding per the science play guidelines, but, why take the chance? I'm hoping there's a little more stricter rules in upcoming conventions. So obviously the next popular science play character would be Albert Einstein. People love playing Einstein. And again, this goes back to how much time he put into his hair. This is always a factor for science play. Whenever you think about Einstein, you think of the theory of relativity. Sure, E = mc squared. But you also think of that poster with his tongue sticking out, and your eyes just focus on the hair. Even with his tongue sticking out, you still kind of focus on the hair. In 1921, he got the Nobel Prize for Physics, and his work was a pivotal step to the development of quantum theory. E = mc squared has been dubbed the world's most famous equation. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, of course. The science play with Albert Einstein, they kind of play up his personality, like this bumbling professor, which I don't think is necessarily true. I think he put a lot of effort into choosing his words very carefully, and I think he was very put together and very aware of his surroundings and what was going on around him. It's interesting that during World War II, he sent a letter to President Roosevelt because he wanted to let him know about a very dangerous new bomb type that Germany had started doing research and development on. This, of course, led to the Manhattan Project, but Einstein, even though he supported the Allies, generally denounced the idea of using fission as a weapon. He actually signed the Russell-Einstein Manifesto with a British philosopher named Bertrand Russell. Now, I'm not sure how he convinced Einstein to put his name second, but so be it. The manifesto, of course, talks about the dangers of nuclear weapons. It's interesting to see at the conference that sometimes this is a couple costume. Sometimes the couples are together and an Einstein walks around with someone dressed like Bertrand Russell. They actually give out their manifestos, which is a fun touch. Sometimes the defense contractors on the vendor floor get a little irritated at this, but they don't really say anything. And it's safer than carrying around real radioactive material like the Madame Curie science players. The last of the science play favorites is Nikola Tesla. That's the other big giant. There's other ones too, but those are the main ones people science play. Now Tesla, again, I hate to say it, but man, that hair. It's clearly a wig, but he never really seemed bothered by it. It's not really well known, but he really thought that wig was temporary, because every night he would use his knowledge of electricity and would stimulate the base of his scalp in hopes of electronically massaging the hair follicles into growing again. It never quite worked out, but as you know, he had a lot of other rather large successes. I mean, he's one of the first people that they would probably call a futurist, and he designed the alternating current electricity supply system. I mean, he was way ahead of his time and had theories about wireless communication that were very forward-thinking. He didn't quite get listened to the way he should have. But again, I think at the conference, people just focus more on the hair. The science players for Tesla, of course, have the Tesla coil, which makes the hair stand up, so again, it always goes back to the hair. But all in all, I have to say, it was a really great science conference. It's always a good time, and like I said, you get to see all your colleagues and see what they're working on, and you get to hang out with old friends. I ran into a bunch of scientists I hadn't seen in such a long time, like our friend Tim and his invisibility pill he was working on. Granted, not everything works out, but he means well. But I don't see this one really happening. I mean, he can make himself transparent, which is a little disturbing, but we mostly just kind of humor him, like, oh, where did Tim go? I hope he'll join us for a drink later. And then he always shows up for the drink, and sometimes he comes transparent, sometimes fully opaque. It depends on his mood and how much he's already drank. Like I said, it's a little disconcerting when he still thinks he's invisible, but he's transparent, and he does start drinking a beer, because you kind of see it go through and then slowly be digested and go into his bloodstream. And we try not to stare, because then it gives it away that we can see him, and also it's a little off-putting. Another great scientist, Gladys from the UK, was actually working on a machine to control the weather, but she said she'd only use it for good, so there's really nothing to worry about there, and we could certainly use a little more weather control in this day and age. You know, last year, I did bring my toast nanoprobes that I talked about on the first episode, but some of the scientists can get a little snobby, so it wasn't as well received as I had hoped. Maybe the world isn't ready for self-toasting toast. I don't know. Anyway, it was a fantastic conference, and I'm so glad I went, and I'm so glad I go every year. And I have to say, when you get all the scientists together in a conference, you really see how important science is and how important these social bonds that we make are. We combine them together, and this is how we move forward as a species. I really believe that as a scientist, because when you have that curiosity and you want to learn how things work and make things better, sometimes you can feel very lonely doing that. But then, when you're with people who have the same feelings that you do and want the same things you do and want to move everything forward to make things better for everyone through technology and science, you realize that you're with kindred spirits. And you know, it doesn't matter that some of them are transparent or working on machines to control the weather, or think that hot air balloons are going to make a comeback as a viable means of transportation. None of that matters, because you're with your colleagues, you're with your friends, and you're sharing a common goal, and when you do that, you also socially bond, and when you socially bond with as many people as possible, you discover that you want to move things forward and make things better for everyone. And the more people you're socially bonded with, the more people you want to help. The more people you want things to be better for. So if you have a healthy curiosity to see how things work, a healthy need to make things better, and a healthy desire to connect and be with your fellow man and understand their wants and needs, you can put them all together. And the Science Conference is really something that kind of brings all these things together, but everyone can do that at home as well. I firmly believe that. Like I said, everyone is a scientist in their own way. Everyone can make the world a little better, with or without scientists. And if you're listening to me, I really think we all have the power to do that for sure. I know that seems kind of overly optimistic, but I really feel like there's nothing wrong with looking on the bright side of things. We already know what the darker side of things looks like. We should be looking at the brighter side, and we should be working towards making that brighter side a reality and bringing it to a scientific fruition. That was the conference. Now, I couldn't take the Orient Express back. It was a one-way train, but that's okay. I was tired of sightseeing by then, so I took a flight back home, and that was it. I want to thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it instills a little bit more of a curiosity to see how things work and how to make things better. Thanks, and I'll see you on the next journey. Oh, one last thing. I know this is only episode 3, but please think about joining the White Cat Adventurers Club. You can go to patreon.com/whitecatentertainment. There's a lot of cool extras like my weekly journal and even a soundscape of every episode if you want to create your own adventure in your mind. Thank you.
The Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood was created, written, and performed by Chris Mancini and produced by White Cat Entertainment. It is a work of fiction. Maybe. Music and sound design by Ron Tansky at rontanskymusic.com. For more info and merchandise, go to whitecatentertainment.com.